One. Good evening, everyone. Dan Jennings here with your Blue Wave Report Candidates Corner. Tonight on the show, we have Eva Putzova running for Congress in Arizona's 1st Congressional District. Good evening, Eva. How are you today?
Good evening, Dan. Thank you for having me. I'm great.
You're very welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and also why you decided to challenge the incumbent in a primary.
Absolutely. So again, my name is Eva Putzova. I grew up in Slovakia. You can tell that I'm an immigrant. I made Flagstaff, Arizona my home in 2000. In 2007, I became a US citizen. The day I became a US citizen, I registered to vote. I registered to vote as a Democrat because those are the values that I grew up with when it comes to inclusion, peace, democracy, equality. Those are important values to me. In 2014, I ran for a local city council here in Flagstaff, and I told voters that I want to bring a living wage to Flagstaff. And when I was elected, unfortunately, I didn't have the council that would legislate a living wage or higher minimum wage. So I ran a local citizen initiative, and we were successful. We passed a $15 minimum wage in Flagstaff, and we also raised the sub-minimum tipped wage to the full minimum wage in Flagstaff, which of course is very unique because, as you may know, there's still 17 states in a country that pay tipped workers $2.13 per hour. I spent my professional career 14 years in higher education, and I'm now employed. I work every day. I work for a fantastic organization called Restaurant Opportunity Centers United as their National Communications and Technology Director. And the organization fights to improve wages and working conditions for the 13 million restaurant workers nationwide. I'm running in Arizona's 1st Congressional District, which is the 10th largest district in the country. It's 3 times the size of my home country, Slovakia, where I grew up. And I'm running as a progressive Democrat. I'm challenging the incumbent because he voted with Trump 54% of the time in the 2018 cycle. He casts votes that I think are very problematic. He voted to deregulate banks and roll back some regulations that were passed under the Dodd-Frank Act. He voted to criminalize immigrants. He voted for the Cates Law. He just this past summer, he was one of the 7 Democrats who voted to give Trump the authority to go to war with Iran without congressional approval. The incumbent also takes money from corporate interests, from corporate PACs and special interests. He's bankrolled by health insurance companies, by arms industry, by private prison industry, and by entities like Walmart and Google and Verizon, any and every corporation you can imagine. We are running a campaign that's a grassroots campaign, and we take absolutely no corporate money and no money from lobbyists, because I think that's part of a big problem, money in politics and how corporations are buying influence in Congress. And so this is why I'm running. And it's not just the votes that the incumbent casts, it's also what he doesn't champion. And he doesn't champion a real bold climate action. And I think without an ambitious policy like Green New Deal, we're not going to have any planet to live on. And so I feel very strongly about it. I feel also very strongly about supporting universal healthcare. I support Medicare for all. I benefited greatly from tuition-free college. My education was completely tuition-free all the way through master's, and I think every single American deserves good education, good quality education without the burden of college debt. As an immigrant, I support a complete immigration overhaul, and I cannot wait when I will be able to work with my colleagues in Congress to make a big policy change in that arena. I also oppose all wars of choice. Oftentimes people ask, oh, how are we going to pay for Medicare for all? How are we going to pay for Green New Deal? And we never, ever question how we are paying for the wars that we've been involved in. So that's kind of in a nutshell who I am, what I stand for. And I hope that voters in Arizona's 1st Congressional District will be supportive of this kind of agenda, this kind of, we call it people's first agenda, putting people, not corporate interests first.
Well, I think you took a lot of my questions off the table right off the top, so that was pretty good. I do want to talk to you a little bit about Medicare for All for a moment. Medicare for All is not really winning the popular, I want to say vote, but popular numbers with people in the country. A lot of people feel like they have their private health insurance. They want to keep their private health insurance. If Medicare for All were unable to come to the floor for a vote, but a public option were to come to the floor, would you vote for a public option allowing only the people who want to enroll in Medicare for All to enroll?
Mm-hmm. So, I will always be upfront that I'm not expert in any particular policy area, and I would have to actually study very carefully how that could work. And from the understanding that I have, and the arguments I've heard against public option is that doesn't really then address the cost of healthcare. And so I will not say whether I would or would not. I will always vote for improvements over current status quo in all policy areas. And I do understand, and I spent 4 years on a local city council, so I understand that sometimes we don't get everything we want. However, I do feel that when I talk to people agree that they want universal health care. I think that there are some issues with what people understand on the Medicare for All. I think that a lot of people do not realize, and they told me that they don't want the same Medicare because it's insufficient. And so I don't think they understand that the Medicare for All is actually a new and improved Medicare. It's not the current Medicare system we have. And so I think if we spend enough time actually educating voters about what that Medicare for All policy is, then they would be way more open to a whole new system. And I also think that, people who say that I like my insurance plan, oftentimes they've never had a real use for their insurance plan. I'm employed, I have plan, I picked something. First of all, it's super confusing, right? Because you don't know what you're really picking, what you're buying, because you cannot oftentimes anticipate what kind of condition you will be dealing with. And it's only when you're dealing with a specific medical condition, you'll finding out that, well, I have a plan, and how come my insurance company is denying coverage for particular drugs? And I've met people who told me they have some of the best, what people consider the best insurance plans in the area, and they spend hours and hours on the phone with insurance agents who keep denying the medications for their kids who are, who suffer from some serious medical condition, and they need this, expensive medication. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to actually educate voters, to present the idea of new and improved Medicare for all, this kind of universal healthcare system that we can all benefit from.
New York State and Washington, D.C., amongst others today, sued the Food and Drug Administration over desire to put in new work requirements for supplemental nutrition assistance program that could put up to 650,000 people out of SNAP. However, we know that 96% of the people in this country are working. So my question to you would be, if elected, would you support a tax on multi-billion-dollar profitable organizations, operations like Walmart, who's do not pay their employees a living wage, and then they have to go on food stamps and whatnot, have that money put into a dedicated fund to help offset costs of SNAP?
So that's very interesting, and I think that that's one way to deal with people who work and who need assistance. Another way is to actually force these corporations and regulate wages, so they actually don't have to depend on assistance. And while I think these are, two different ways, there is no single person who want to be on public assistance, especially when they work. So number one policy that I would support is to make sure that no single person who works for a living has to depend on public assistance for basics like food or shelter or healthcare. And we know this is way too common, and it's not just retailers like Walmart, but it's also, I mentioned, tipped workers that I work with every time. So how come we accept the kind of society where we allow corporations reap incredible benefits from people's productivity and yet pay them so little? If the minimum wage kept pace with productivity, then today's minimum wage compared to the minimum wage in the 60s would be around $22 per hour. And I think this is our problem, is like we are somehow we accept that it's okay for people to be paid poverty wages. And so what the policy that you suggested, I think it's second best, right? I still think that the number one policy should be that we demand that working people get paid a living wage.
Great. A couple questions on military as related to presidential authority. Last week, Donald Trump came out and basically stated that the only reason our troops are still in Syria is to take the oil, which would be a violation of the Geneva Convention and a war crime. Also today, it came out that Saudi Arabia last December paid the United States government $500 million, not a billion like the president wants people to believe, for our troop presence in their country. Would you support and push a law that would direct the Pentagon to disobey any order from any president, Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, any order from the White House that could constitute a war crime or our soldiers being rented out as mercenaries?
Wow, that's what a interesting law that would be. And again, my first instinct tells me that we absolutely should never be engaged in any initiative, any activity that constitutes a war crime. So on the surface, I would say yes, but of course, I haven't had chance to think about what would be or could be some repercussions, and could this lead or be used for some other outcomes where Pentagon essentially is not responsive to the commander in chief. And so this is maybe a wishy-washy kind of answer, but
no, it's no,
on
no. By all means,
on a
it's a good answer.
service, yeah, on a service, yes, but I would have to truly understand what how this could be abused, because
No.
I think that's the part that I think that it's absolutely horrible when we, as a country, as a republic, as a democracy, are engaged in activities when we take justice into our own hands the way we would never tolerate in our own country. I think that we have to change the direction of our foreign policy, and this is something that this is not a Republican or Democratic kind of position, because we've had both political elites from both parties behave very similarly when it comes to foreign policy, and I hope that we can change that.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your policy and your work with the indigenous tribes in your region.
So when I was on the Flagstaff City Council, I initiated indigenous people's forums, and it was really conversation where we council member came to actually listen to indigenous people sharing their stories, their struggles, their grievances, and where we have been talking about injustices that Native communities experience today. I was the one who initiated Indigenous Peoples Day here in Flagstaff, and we were able to pass it. But of course, it's in some way symbolic gesture. It's empty, it doesn't, if something more substantial doesn't follow, because we need to address racial profiling that's happening in our communities. And, in Flagstaff is a border town to many Native communities, and 50% of all arrests in my hometown are Native Americans, and that's a problem. So I work very closely with a number of people who are very involved in Native issues. And I'm hoping that we as a country can start putting first people first. Oftentimes, when you hear about various outcomes, whether it's health outcomes or economic outcomes, social outcomes, Native Americans, indigenous people are not oftentimes even mentioned in their experience some of the worst injustices and some of the worst social, health, economic, educational outcomes from among all minorities. So I'm very committed to Native American people, and to really treat them as real partners. I mean, we have to really look into the mirror and not treat them as, we're going to do something for them. No, they need to be in charge, making decisions, be real partners. And, we impose the Western form of government on their tribes. And, they are not in charge of their own land. We pretend that this is somehow their land, when it comes to federally recognized tribes. But in fact, we have an agency that manages that land. And I think our tribes are perfectly capable managing their own resources, and we need to treat them like that and stop. We have to really stand by the treaties that we have signed. And, we have been breaking those treaties left and right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have two final questions for you. The first one is on abortion, well, kind of on abortion. We have seen studies in states that suggest that comprehensive sex education and access to contraception for teenagers is one of the best ways to drive down the abortion rate. Colorado's dropped precipitously when they went to that. Some other areas of the country as well. If elected, would you work with the Department of Education to come up with a plan to institute comprehensive sex education nationwide in our schools, also with an opt-in for the children without parental authority to receive contraception?
Absolutely. My grandmother died from a botched abortion. It was in 1946 in the post-war Europe. And I feel that where we are with the conversation about abortion and with our laws is not far from where post-war Europe was. And I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous to accept the idea that women are not or should not be in control of their own bodies. And of course, sex education, abortion is a medical procedure, and it can be dangerous when it, performed in a medical setting. And I don't think anybody advocates for people having any medical procedures unless they really need to, including abortion. And so I think sex education is absolutely necessary. I think that young people are completely capable to consume the information on their own without parental approval. There is no reason why contraception should not be available to young girls and maybe young boys in the future. Hopefully we will see more about male contraception. I really think that in this area we have a lot of work to do, and I would certainly support that kind of sex education to be available, to be mandated perhaps in our schools, just like we say that every student has to have has to take certain amount of credits in mathematics or English or any other subject.
Mm-hmm. All right, final question. Do you support statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, we've seen how important it is that people in DC and Puerto Rico, they have a say. They contribute to our country. They're part of our society, and yet they cannot participate in the political process in a way that everybody else can. Their communities are not represented. And so I absolutely will support that.
Great. All right. Well, Eva, thank you for being on the show tonight. I appreciate your time, and I wish you the best of luck going forward in your run. And like I said off the air earlier, once the primaries are over, should you move forward, we can come back and do a longer segment.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for having me.
You're very welcome. And that has been the Candidates Corner for tonight. Our guest was Eva Putzova, running for Congress in Arizona's Congressional District Number 1. This is Dan Jennings for your Blue Wave Report, reminding you as always, don't just comment, act. Good night, everybody.